Hello, everybody, and welcome. Glad to see you here today, this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you happen to be. I'm Diane Richler. I'm the chair of Inclusion International's Catalyst for Inclusive Education, and really happy to be part of this event today, which is extremely important. We are gradually getting people to join both through this platform and also people watching from around the world. We have a number of housekeeping details that I'd just like to review, please. If I could have the next slide. Okay, we're not seeing the slides filling the whole screen. If we could try to change that. But just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. We want you to keep your cameras and microphones off unless as a speaker you're speaking at that time. We do have international sign and the interpreters are visible in the gallery. Panelists will be speaking in both English and French. So if you speak only one of those languages, please click on the option channel at the bottom of your screen where there's a picture of a globe, picture of the world, and you can then see, select your language. Closed captioning in English is embedded. And if you need captions in the external window, the link is in the chat box. We hope that there will be a lot of participation from all of you. You're invited to type questions or comments either in the Q&A or in the chat, and they'll be addressed later on in the session or answered in writing. And we've also had a suggestion that we will gather questions, and if there is enough content for a discussion, we may try to prepare a blog as a follow-up to share the discussion of this session with more people. So thank you. I want to remind you that today's event is being convened by the International Disability and Development Consortium, IDDC, the World Bank, Education Section, the GLAD Network, Global Action on Disability, Humanity and Inclusion, CBM, Inclusion International, and Leonard, Cheshire. And clearly, if you've joined this webinar, you agree that we need more discussion about accelerating progress towards SDG 4. We've had definite problems caused by the COVID pandemic. And so even though learners with disabilities were among the most excluded before the pandemic, we've lost traction because of the pandemic. And so this discussion is really important. Lack of reliable data and disaggregated data makes it difficult to know how we're doing in terms of reaching Agenda 2030. And having good data helps us to keep track. Many countries actually underestimate the number of potential learners with disabilities because of their invisibility. And that's why a focus on data is so important. We need to develop comprehensive inclusive education systems that respond to the intersecting and multiple discriminating factors experienced by different individuals and groups and avoid segregation. And I think that that's one of the big issues that came up during the discussions leading to the Transforming Education pre-summit that was held in Paris last week, that there's often a lack of focus on the multiple identities of children and adolescents and all potential learners, which narrows the kinds of policies that are developed and the programs that are developed. But good policies require informed and robust disaggregated data and research. And all of that requires meaningful participation with the relevant stakeholders. That means persons with disabilities, their families, organizations working to promote inclusion of persons with disabilities, teachers, and people throughout the education system. We do have increasing examples of education management information systems, EMIS, collecting data on disability, and many countries committed to using the Washington Group questions. But as I mentioned before, the pandemic really has highlighted educational inequities. So now we need to focus on good evidence in order that systems can be better prepared, not only to deal with the existing situation, but also to be able to handle future crises. Over the next 90 minutes, you're going to be hearing from a range of panelists. We have a young person who has a disability representing an organization of persons with disabilities. We have representatives of non-governmental organizations, of senior government representatives, and leaders who are promoting the inclusion of people with disabilities around the world. All of this on the eve of the commencement of the high-level political forum. We've come together to issue a call for action for governments and the donor community to strengthen the data systems that will inform financing and policies and promote access to education in the aftermath of the pandemic. And we really hope to hear your voices today. We're really pleased to have with us Claudia Kappa, who's the Senior Advisor, Statistics, Child Protection and Development at UNICEF, who will tell us more about how UNICEF supports improvements in disaggregated data collection, key challenges, and how the recent report, Seen, Counted, Included, that she co-authored, aligns with today's reflections. Claudia was extremely generous with us today because she's actually speaking to us on her holiday, and she's going to have to leave immediately after her presentation. So will not be available to answer questions, but I encourage you, if you do have questions of her, put them in the Q&A or in the chat. We'll forward them to Claudia after her holiday, and we will get back to you with a response. So Claudia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Diane, for this introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's an honor for me to be able to join you today. I didn't want to miss the opportunity to join our conversation about inclusive education. And I wanted to do so because we have now, finally, a significant amount of statistics on children with disabilities and education. And it's an important testament to the efforts of many who really wanted to build this statistical knowledge. So I wanted to share with you, and we can go into the next slide, the main findings of UNICEF's report that was launched last year. The report is titled Seen, Counted, Included, and is the largest compilation of data and statistics on children with disabilities. In this report, we have been able to include comparable data, internationally comparable data from 42 low and middle income countries. And for these countries, we are finally able to report on over 60 indicators of well-being, including several sustainable development goals. And most of these indicators are actually related to education. In addition, the report also includes, for the first time, global and regional estimates based on data from more than 100 countries. So let's go to the next slide. And let's start by reflecting jointly on the definitions and the instrument that were used to collect this data. Because disability measurement has been a concern of government for many, many years. Actually, the first censuses to include questions on persons with disability go back to the 19th centuries. But what has been problematic is the type of definitions and instruments used to identify persons with disabilities. Previous data collection efforts used definitions that were stigmatizing, offensive, and very narrow, based on very restrictive definitions and medical views of disability. To overcome this limitation, UNICEF and the Washington Group on Disability Statistics, over a period of 5 years, worked to develop a new data collection instrument, the Child Functioning Module, that is based on the ICF model of disability. The module includes 2 sets of questions. The first set of questions is for children under the age of 5 and asks mothers about the difficulty that the child has in certain activities. In this slide, I'm showing the type of functional difficulties that are captured in the child functioning module for children under the age of 5. And these include difficulty seeing, hearing, difficulty walking, difficulty controlling behavior, difficulty with picking up small objects, difficulty understanding and being understood, difficulty learning, and difficulty playing. In the next slide, I want to show you what is covered in the child functioning module for older children between the ages of 5 and the ages of 17. We have more domains, and we are able to identify children with functional difficulties on the basis of a more comprehensive definition that include difficulty in accepting change, difficulty in communication, in hearing, in remembering, difficulty concentrating, learning and seeing, difficulty in controlling the behavior, making friends, walking, difficulty with self-care, but also difficulty in managing emotion. So we do capture, for instance, children who have display signs of anxiety and depression. So as you can see, the universe of children that is captured through the child functioning module is a bigger universe and include, for instance, children with psychosocial difficulties that have been traditionally neglected in data collection efforts. Let's go now to the next slide, because I want to show you what we have learned from the analysis of this data. First of all, when we are talking about children with disabilities, we are talking about nearly 240 million children. So this is a number that is much bigger than previous estimates. Worldwide, this corresponds to approximately 1 in 10 children overall. And the larger proportions of children with functional difficulties are found in West and Central Africa and Middle East and North Africa. Let's go to the next slide. Who made up this number? Who are these children that we are talking about? Well, many of the children that are part of this 240 million estimates are children with difficulty in the psychosocial domain. And psychosocial difficulty actually predominate across all ages. The graph I'm showing here presents the distribution of children with functional difficulty by type of functional difficulty. And for children under the age of 5, approximately 1 in 3 have difficulty controlling their behavior. 16% have difficulty learning. 14% have difficulty communicating. So for younger children, difficulty learning, communicating, and difficulty managing their emotion are the most predominant forms of functional difficulties. Going now to the next slide. Also, in the case of children between the ages of 5 and 17, anxiety, depression, difficulty controlling the behavior, and accepting change, they represent the bulk of the functional difficulties that these children, these 240 million children, experience. So why am I insisting on describing this population? Because this diversity in the difficulties and the living experience of these children is also a diversity that we will see when we look at their education, for instance, at their well-being, at their access to services, because this population is diverse in the type of functional difficulty that these children experience, but also this diversity is reflected on the levels of deprivations that they might experience in education and also more broadly in their well-being. Let's go to the next slide. Because I wanted to start showing you the data that we have through this household survey that specifically look at important measures of education. Children with disabilities are more likely to be out of school. This is something that we already knew, but now we have the statistical evidence and the numbers to support this knowledge. In this graph, I'm showing the percentage of children out of primary school, out of secondary school, and specifically out of upper secondary school, depending on their disability status. So, and as you can see from this slide, 7% overall of children without disabilities in the 42 countries for which we have data are out of school, 7%. But when it comes to children, for instance, with any form of disability, it goes up to 11% at the primary level. When it comes to children with multiple disability, this number goes to 15%. And then if we are looking at children with severe functional difficulties, the number goes up to 32%. Just think about that. 7% children without disability, 32% children with severe disability. And this is at the primary school level. If we look at, for instance, the upper secondary school, we have 27% of children without disability who are out of upper secondary school, but this number becomes 67% among children with severe disabilities. But it was also for us important to realize is that access to school is very different depending on the type of functional difficulties that these children have. And this is what is displayed in the next slide. This graph shows the percentage, for instance, of primary school age children who are out of primary school or higher, depending on the domain of functional difficulty that they experience and whether they have severe or milder form of functional difficulties. And as you can see, and I can describe through this graph, there is a wide variation even within the population of children with disability in terms of school access. For instance, children with difficulty communicating, learning, and concentrating, more than 75% of them are out of primary school. Primary school, this is very basic. Most countries have achieved universal primary school education. But when it comes to, for instance, children with difficulty walking, accepting change, or controlling behavior, there is still a significant proportion of them that is out of school, but not as high as those with difficulty concentrating. So we really want to understand access to school for children with disabilities. We have to look at severity of the disability, and we need to look at the type of functional difficulty that they experience. Now, going to the next slide, and I'm about to finish. I also wanted to show other indicators related to education, because the deprivation the children with disability experience is not only in terms of access to education, but is also in terms of support that they receive at home, for instance, parental support. This graph shows the percentage of children between the ages of 7 and the ages of 14 who read books or are read books at home by their parents or their caregivers. In the case of children without functional difficulty, 73% of them receive some form of learning support at home. In the case of children with disability, this number drops to 65. And when it comes, for instance, to children with difficulty communicating, the number goes down even more. Only 50% of them read books or are read books at home. And if I were to show you this type of data disaggregated by difficulty, by the severity of the difficulty, you will see the children with very severe forms of functional difficulty are very likely to be deprived from receiving parental support at school and also at home. And lastly, I wanted to show how soon this type of deprivation starts. In the next slide, I wanted to share
And I'm
with
going
you.
to have to ask you to come to an end quickly, Claudia,
Yes,
although
this is the last.
fascinating.
Yes, this is the last slide. Thank you. Thank you, Diane. So I wanted to share with you this graph to show the percentage of children between the ages of 24 and 59 months who are engaged in activities at home with their caregivers to stimulate their brain. In the case of children without disability, 45% of these children receive early stimulation and responsive caregiving by their parents. But when it comes to children, for instance, with multiple disability, only 25% of them receive early stimulation in the youngest cohort in the early years compared to children with disabilities. So this is just to say that unfortunately, and this is my concluding statement, when it comes to education, children with disability, and particularly certain children with disabilities, are more likely to be deprived from the benefit of education, but also from the support that they need at home by their caregivers. I hope you find this useful, and there's much more that you will be able to see in the report. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Claudia. That was really informative and so well presented. And I guess the thing that comes to mind for me is that how important it is for the information that you've presented to be better known in terms of the monitoring of SDG 4. You know, at the end of last year, the GEM report team and the UNESCO Institute for Statistics published their Data Digest 2021, looking at national SDG 4 benchmarks. And the kind of information that you presented is not evident there. And I really worry that many people who are looking at SDG 4 broadly really are not aware of this data. So we will do our best to share your information. It's really terrific. Thank you, and have a great holiday. We're going to turn now to, we know how bad the situation is. One organization that's trying to rectify that is the World Bank. And we're happy to have with us today Hannah Halasuturi, who is responsible for inclusive education at the bank. And she's going to talk both about the framework for disability inclusion that the bank uses, as well as the guidance that they're providing for ensuring the inclusion of learners with disabilities. So Hannah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Diane. I hope you can hear me well and that we soon see the slides coming up. Thanks very much, Rita, for helping out with that. So lovely to be here today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. As Diane shortly introduced, I'm Hanna Halasuturi, Senior Education Specialist globally for inclusive education in the World Bank Education Global Practice. And today, I'm looking at how to institutionalize disability inclusion in an organization like World Bank, and in particular with education operations. Evidence and participation to shape inclusive education policies is very, very critical. And what we've tried to do in the World Bank is to really operationalize all of this into the way we work with our partner countries. On the next slide, you can see the 3 different points that I'm going to be discussing today. First, key framework supporting disability inclusion and systemic change will be elaborated. Then I'll go into the guidance of disability inclusion in education operations. And at the end, I mention how we work with professional development and training. We name it Education Policy Academy, and we have particular activities for Inclusive Education Policy Academy. So then for the key frameworks, next slide, please. And the following can come. It's very important that an organization will have an enabling environment to really institutionalize these type of activities. At the World Bank, we are implementing environmental and social framework, which really gives us a way to help the teams to work on what they already should be doing. This document includes a good practice note on non-discrimination and disability, and there is also a directive. So this means that both staff as well as the clients working with the bank are bound to follow this. Our disability inclusion team has put together a disability and inclusion accountability framework, which was first launched at the first Global Disability Summit 2018, along with the 10 commitments on disability inclusive development. These commitments have been very instrumental for us. We were very ambitious for the education, ensuring that all World Bank investment project financing projects will be disability inclusive by 2025. So this is really our target, and we've been working in order to reach that. IDA 19 and IDA 20 are also very helpful, as those have disability as cross-cutting themes, as well as particular policy commitment. But then really to the education, we have safe and inclusive schools pillar as part of the education approach, which will be shown in the next slide. We use the twin track approach with inclusive education. So as you can see in this slide, we have safe and inclusive schools pillar. It's on its own, because these themes are something that needs really a focused approach, as well as the cross-cutting nature. So with prepared learners, effective teachers, classrooms, which includes curriculum assessment and learning and teaching materials, as well as leadership, all need inclusive lens. So the approach is really to work with all different thematic areas we have as part of our education approach, different levels of education, as well as then looking at what is the specific focus that also learners with disabilities need. In addition to these themes you can see on this slide, we also have education technology, as well as education finance, that also have components on inclusive education. So in the next slide, we'll go a little bit more details for the guidance that we have for disability inclusion in our operations. We have, in the next slide, you can see the document itself. It's available online. Please take some time to take a look if you can. It's really planned in a way that makes sense for the World Bank staff. So it's trying to really go into practical guidance on how to do inclusive project and really ensure disability inclusion. It also has additional resources, inclusive education resource guide, among others, that teams can use. If we go to the next slide, we can see in a little bit more details about the key concepts that we use in our guidance. So inclusive education, really reminding that we are talking about profound cultural shift to attain one system of education. Disability, as Claudia Kappa before me already described, is really important to emphasize that it's not a medical model, but based on Convention of the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities and a social model of disability inclusion. Intersectionality, as already outlined by Diane in the beginning of this webinar, is very important. Different identities play a role and might result in multiple forms of exclusion and discrimination. In the next slide, you can see the other three key concepts that we work with. So universal design for learning, also twin track approach, and reasonable accommodation. The actual 4 criteria are then shown on the next slide. So first is the stakeholder engagement, which really emphasizes that all World Bank project teams need to go for the people who already work with disability inclusion and proto inclusion in the country that they work with. It's important to include organizations of persons with disabilities here, so that it's really possible to see what's going on in the country. And it's also important to look what are the other stakeholders doing so that nobody works in silo. The analysis outlines the topic of this webinar, how important it is to make sure that data is collected. So if there is already some disability disaggregated data, then the team should utilize that. If not, how to work within the time frame that they have in order to contribute to the country and their situation. So usually the project cycle is for 5 years or a bit more with the World Bank projects. It is really not that longer marathon that the country is doing anyway. So how to contribute to that? We then have the third criteria that emphasizes the project design, which needs to be inclusive. And teams can either do this using the general education or the focused approach. So twin track is recommended. You can do both, but at least one of them. To make it all work, monitoring and reporting is also critical. Next slide. Here is just a reminder on how the criteria can be addressed in different parts of the project documentation. However, the implementation is what matters. And on the next slide, I'll be able to go in a little bit more details on looking at what happens in the country levels. I've chosen 2 examples here. There is Rwanda as well as Gambia. And I'm not going to be reading all of this, as you can do it while watching this webinar. But this is a clear example of what the projects can actually do within the existing funding mechanism, however, with some additional support. So we've been very happy to see some trust fund funding coming in to the country teams. For example, Rwanda is one of those countries that has been implementing inclusive education initiative for the past 2 years and is able to really see that how this plays out in the longer term education development. And there has been critical shifts, and some of these shifts also, they do take time. So I think that's also always important to make sure that the evidence is collected the way it really helps the country, and then enough time is used for those important processes that need to be there in order to make this sustainable in the country. Next slide. So last here, I'm going to briefly talk about the professional development and training program that we work with. So we have the World Bank Education Policy Academy, which is briefly introduced in the next slide, where you can see how different thematic areas, literacy policy, teachers, education, early childhood education, education finance, and results-based financing, as well as inclusive education and educational technology are part of those themes that we now work. So it's a professional development and training program for building knowledge and capacity in designing and implementing those kind of education policies that really make sense for the country. So the audience for this professional development training activities, both the World Bank staff as well as our client country colleagues, so ministries of education and others. And in the next slide, you can see a little bit more in details what we've done with inclusive education so far. So we were able to carry out one inclusive education policy academy in Rwanda, which we started in November last year and finished March this year. And with this inclusive education policy academy, we actually included only one country. The idea of this concept is really to have more countries from the region together, and some of the learning will happen online, some of it as a group, live sessions, peer working with peers, as well as self-paced study. We had over 30 multi-sectoral stakeholders who participated in this Rwanda Inclusive Education Policy Academy. And the themes were also chosen in a way that really made sense for Rwanda. So we spent time in making sure that we collect the information from the participants and also stakeholders in Rwanda to see that what's really needed. We had collaboration with global, regional, and country level actors. And we organized the live sessions in such a way that we would have a global leader, either researcher or practitioner, talking together with a local colleague. We had WhatsApp groups as well as the Moodle platform supporting the conversations. A community of practice was initiated through these activities. And the next phase is to invite other countries in the region to join. And I think with Inclusive Education Policy Academy, it is also important that we have not only Ministry of Education representatives, but also other stakeholders. I think these type of activities to support the countries in the country level, long run, not as one-off, is very important. And at the same time, an organization like World Bank can really make sure that it's not going to be something that is done for a certain period of time, that learners with disabilities are going to be visible in the work that is being done and really not be lost in there. For the last slide, you can see the emails that you can reach out to me and the Inclusive Education Thematic Group. And I really look forward to collaborating more with colleagues here in the webinar. And after that, Diane, over to you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for a really comprehensive overview. We're starting to collect some questions, so I would remind people to please post your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A. We've also had some requests for copies of people's presentations. I will ask presenters, if you're willing to have your slides shared, please let us know. We won't share them unless you give us permission, but we will be able to share copies of the recording of the event, as well as any of the links that are mentioned in the presentations. So I hope that that will work for people. Because we need to, every presentation is so fascinating, and I hate to cut people off, but I'm really going to ask the presenters to try to keep to their 7 minutes. And the next person, and I'm sorry to put pressure on you because I know you have so much to say, Josh Josa leads the Disability Inclusive Education work at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and I turn it over to you, Josh.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to be here to be a part of this panel presentation. I'm a disability inclusive education specialist at Usaid Center for Education. First, I'd like to say the US really has a strong commitment to 2030 agenda, and we are fully committed to its implementation. SDG 4 related to quality education is an emphasis, and it's so important because education provides for future generations skills and tools to be able to lead healthy and productive lives and contributing to the community. US government contributes over $1 billion in programming and assistance to improve education systems worldwide. Collecting and the use of disaggregated data is really such an important piece of tracking in how we proceed and improve education programming. And it's vital for achieving USAID educational policy priorities, contributing to quality education for children, pre-primary all the way to higher education. USAID, our Envision for disability measurement is where children and youth globally are able to engage in quality and equitable education. And that vision is based from the 2018 educational policy and the GEM report on inclusive education, as well as the International Disability Alliance Inclusive Education Report. We recognize that disability disaggregated data alone cannot only help succeed that vision. Inclusive education programming must be supported with a variety of things like data systems, what Claudia and Hannah mentioned, the EMIS, budgeting for program support. We need early and periodically to have screening and identification to make sure that all children and youth are able to achieve their full potential. And it's important that it's important for education outcomes as well. Administrative data systems worldwide have yet to be consistently collecting disaggregated data. And we're far from universal screening and identification. We have been working towards that world with the understanding that USAID continues to work with partners such as you all here today to strengthen our ability to determine disability prevalence as well as data outcomes to make sure that we are producing the necessary data to strengthen systems where we're working.
Excuse me,
Why
Josh.
are we collecting?
Josh, I know you have so much to say, but can I ask you to slow down a little bit to help our interpreters who are having trouble keeping up with your fast-moving mind?
Absolutely, no problem. Thank you so much. The reason why we're collecting disability data is because data lets us know which groups of learners may need additional support. So that way they are able to have equitable access to education. That data with the outcome data together, disability data then can show the gaps within learning outcomes for people with disabilities, as well as highlight the need to improve targeted areas for students with disabilities. There are other indicators also for disability data that can also help partner countries make data-informed decisions about where to invest in education. That is crucial for the lowest resource context where USAID education programming is working. I want to share with you all now how USAID is working within this disability data measurement space and how it's transformed over the past few years. About 7 years ago, USAID wasn't doing much in this space. We have since then started doing data work along with adapted early grade reading assessments. That is our first foray into disability data. And early grade reading assessments and assessing students at their reading levels. And there was no adaptation for disabled students. So we created that so that way students who are blind or have low vision or deaf or hard of hearing, through that, we then realized that there were so many issues. We were making sure that they were actually having, we weren't sure if they were having learning difficulties or a disability, and what their understanding of the exam was it accurate? And once we got those results, we realized that overall students with disabilities, their learning outcomes were not on par with students that did not have disabilities. With that impact, we realized we needed to do more disability disaggregated data collection and making sure that we're tracking that data as well. A lot of work has gone into that, as well as lessons learned, and other lessons learned, such as we need universal screening identifiers. And then we also need, as well as home and in the school context. We recognize that there's a need for hearing and vision screenings prior to other tests. And we also realize that students with learning or cognitive disabilities, they're harder to identify. So all of those then created, since those past 2 years, since we started in this work, we've released a guidance note on how we can collect disability data and its prevalence within education programming. Since that time, we've seen an increase in USAID education action in regards to disability disaggregated data. For an example, for fiscal year 2020, 23 out of 29 USAID education operating units reported on disability data. Prior to that, a year ago in 2019, only 9 missions. So that increase was quite significant. Right now, we have 3 large investments to Cambodia, Nepal, and Malawi, where there's a multi-country study, and it's called the MIXI in short. And within that study and the work that we're doing, we have targeted emphasis on how they collect data and how we can improve data collection within those countries. And we'll be releasing a report on that within the next 3 months. So look forward to that. In addition to what I mentioned previously, the challenges that we face in identifying and screening students within the education system, we are now moving towards doing a validation study of the Washington Group Child Functioning Module teacher version in Nepal. I also want to mention that we, as part of the Disability Summit, we wanted to make a commitment to invest more in disability data and disaggregation. One piece of our commitment is we just published a USAID Education Disability Measurement Toolkit. Within that toolkit, there are different tools, resources related to collecting disability prevalence data in education programming, as well as we have a help desk where anyone here can go to the help desk and ask, hey, how can we make this better for collecting data? Or which is a better tool to use to collect data or instruments? I just want to say that some of what our next steps related to improving disability measurements are, we recognize that there are limitations in existing measurement tools and how we identify children with disabilities, especially in the education context. Now the availability of appropriate disability prevalence measurement tools within our requirements for collecting data, we're requiring them they tend to depend on age or their parents' needs for accessing both of these things, but we are working on trying to progress the validation tools. Like I mentioned previously, the child functioning module, that work that we're doing in Nepal is expected to start this summer and will continue till April 2023. So we might be getting new information that we can all learn from and adapt our approaches. It's also, we're so excited to collaborate with the Washington Group on this effort also. We're hoping that USAID education reporting disability disaggregated data will continue to increase, and we can learn from each other going forward what are the best ways to measure, and what are lessons learned that we should avoid while doing disability measurement. And from pre-primary all the way to higher education, we are able to learn from what we're doing and what the benefits are for children and youth with disabilities and improving their education outcomes. I will add a link into the chat for our toolkit that we mentioned, and I appreciate the opportunity and the time for being here with all of you today. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Josh, really comprehensive. And your leadership is very much appreciated. Just a reminder, we are getting a few questions, which is terrific. Also, some people have introduced themselves in the chat, and I encourage more people to do that. Let us know your name, what country you're from, what organization you're from, so that we can have a sense of who's listening. And now I'm going to suggest that we move on to a video that's been provided from Luis Gabriel Villarreal, of Colombia, who's going to give a perspective from a self-advocate. So if we can have the video now, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Luis Gabriel Villarreal Peralta, and I am a self-advocate member from Inclusion International, representing the region of the Americas, and also I'm a self-advocate member from ASDAUN, Colombia. First of all, I'm so honored and so happy to speak on this side event on the evidence and participation of the shape inclusive education policies for people with intellectual disabilities. Now, let's begin. It's important to have the presence and voices of people with intellectual disabilities in the population data collection because it shows how valuable we are in the building better societies process. It lets people know our wants and needs to be fully heard and to be fully included and to be heard and to be fully included and the required support along with them. It shows that we have a place and voices in our families and communities, and it allows us to have more participation and share our experiences and ideas on how to build more inclusive and accessible social policies for people with intellectual disabilities and people of all types. Last month, Inclusion International and Down Syndrome International launched the Listen Include Respect guidelines on inclusive participation. And Listen Include Respect is the work that Inclusion International and Down Syndrome International are doing to support and promote inclusive participation. And it is a set of guidelines and tools created by people with intellectual disabilities and their families around the world that allows organizations to have a fully inclusive participation and supports organizations of all types to be more inclusive of people with intellectual disabilities. Endorsing, applying, and implementing the Listen, Include, Respect guidelines will allow stakeholders and organizations work to be more inclusive and open because the use of easy-to-read information, material, and practical checklists will help people with intellectual disabilities, their supporters, and their organizations to have a more meaningful and real participation in several key life aspects. We believe these guidelines will help organizations and their initiatives to support people with intellectual disabilities and their families and supporters to have a meaningful, inclusive participation in all aspects in the society. We also think the guidelines will help schools, universities, and educational centers to support children and youth with intellectual disabilities in order to have a meaningful, inclusive experience in the classrooms through the implementation of easy-to-read material, accessible technologies, and practical accessibility support. You are welcome to meet our guidelines. You can visit Listen Include Respect website www.listenincluderespect.com to see the guidelines and follow us through social media to know more about them. Now, it's time to work together. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias.
Okay, I need the host to allow me to start my video again, please. Okay, thank you very much. I thought that was a very powerful presentation by Luis Gabriel. And what really struck me was his statement that really education is about building better societies, and inclusive education is about building better societies that include everyone. And as long as we keep some people out of education, we're really setting a path for them to be excluded from their communities for the rest of their lives. So thank you to Luis Gabriel. Now we're being very flexible, which is part of what inclusive education is all about. We were supposed to be joined by Matanzima Mweli, who's the Director General of the Department of Basic Education in the Republic of South Africa. He is in the field and having the connectivity problems that so many people face in education. But we're very lucky to have Maurice Goman with us, who is going to present Mr. Mweli's slides and do his presentation for him. So over to you, Marie. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane, for this opportunity to present on behalf of Mr. Mweli. I'm just trying to get full screen. Yes, so this presentation will be dealing, can someone just tell me if it's a full screen view?
Not yet, Marie.
Okay. Is that better?
Nope. There, now you have it.
Okay. The presentation will be dealing with access and some statistics, how South Africa has managed to increase enrollment since it launched its policy on inclusive education in 2002, now celebrating the 20th year of implementation. How inclusion is embedded in the sector plan, how a policy on early identification and intervention embeds screening and identification and data collection right back into the classroom. The other measures taken by the ministry to implement inclusivity across the whole system, such as accommodations in assessments, looking at learning programs for children with intellectual disabilities, curriculum for the deaf, resources being made available throughout the system, and how we have how South Africa has moderated the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of statistics, in 2002, when the policy was launched, there were 295 segregated special schools. They have since increased to or doubled in number to 489, mostly public schools. The enrollment in special schools has also increased significantly over the 20 years. The system has introduced a number of model or flagship inclusion schools, which have risen from 30 to 848 out of a total of 26,000 schools in the country. And the number of learners with disabilities in public ordinary schools still remain significantly high, namely 121,000. It's risen quite significantly. And then there's a new cohort of children who previously were denied the right to basic education, namely children with severe to profound intellectual disability, 4,000 getting services from the state and a curriculum and stimulation program. It is significant that the department has included inclusivity central into its sector plan, its national sector plan, which is realizing education for all up to 2030, and goal 26 makes provision for expanding provision for children in an inclusive system. A core policy of the department is the policy on screening, identification, assessment and support, which allows for every teacher to screen a child, not only looking at the intrinsic disability, but also at the barriers experienced by the child, so as to provide support for the child, plan individualized support, and then capture all this data, not only of the number of children, but also the kind of support that they get into the national EMIS system. There's an incremental rollout plan for training all teachers in the country, and research shows that at least 65% of schools are now implementing this policy fully. The policy, or actually operational guidelines on accommodations and concessions, which were early on were these concessions and accommodations were only available for children writing the end of schooling examination, but this is now available to children right from the first grade, so that fairness in assessment throughout the system is guaranteed for children, and the system is also trained to be able to apply this across ordinary and special schools. Several types of curricula are available to meet the needs of children with disabilities. The mainstream curriculum, the national curriculum statement, is an inclusive curriculum, and curriculum differentiation is embedded into this curriculum. But in order to accommodate the specific needs of children with profound and severe intellectual disability, as well as moderate intellectual disability, adapted learning programs have been introduced into the system to allow for more functional learning across a number of grades, and this has been introduced to raise the level of the quality of curriculum delivered for all groups. And this has been quite a big initiative of the department, training of really thousands and thousands of teachers to implement this. A big achievement of South Africa is that South African Sign Language is accepted as the 11th official language for the purposes of education, and a curriculum has been developed so that children can now take South African Sign Language as a second official language. South Africa has 2 official languages compulsory. Children who are deaf can replace the second official language with sign language, and a full curriculum has been developed, which has been quite a landmark for the Department of Education. Resources obviously is a big need for the system. The system has developed workbooks, interactive literacy and numeracy workbooks for all grades from the reception year up to grade 9. In all the main subject areas, and these are therefore available to children of all disability types and other learning difficulties, and especially for Braille. These books have been adapted for Braille users, for children who are blind or low vision, and have been made available in Braille to all children who are visually impaired in the country. These are just examples of the workbooks being adapted. This goes with toolkits, tactile toolkits, which is part of the national tender, so that these can be provided to all schools in the country. Also, attention has been given to early Braille learning, and the workbooks for the pre-primary has been developed in the form of a initial Braille workbook. And the last slide is that the ministry has worked very hard to introduce assistive technology through the system, reprioritizing resources, developing guidelines to meet the needs of children who have fallen behind. And during the lockdown periods, there's been a huge increase in the use of technology in the country. And I think that it is really part of the system to make sure that nobody is left behind going forward. Thank you. That is the whole presentation.
Thank you, Marie. That was really great. And I didn't properly introduce you because Marie is with Leonard Cheshire International. But when she worked for the Ministry of Education in South Africa, she really sowed the seeds that made all of this possible. So it's great to see that the work has continued, Marie, and that there are positive results to show. We're now going to move on to our next presentation. And I would just suggest this presentation is going to be in French. So if you don't understand French, please go to the globe at the bottom of your screen and press English, and you will get English translation. And we're going to hear from Uget Rakaturovny, who's the coordinator of the Malagasy National Coalition for Education for All and a partner in the Helasia project. Uget, c'est à vous maintenant. Merci.
Oui. Merci à vous. Merci à vous tous ici. Merci à tous les organisateurs.
Thank you, and thanks you to you, dear listeners. And of course, thank you for inviting me to focus on the theme of inclusive education. It is a very important theme in my view, and in my opinion, it concerns us all, but also makes it incumbent upon us to all fight and work every day on this. My purpose here is firstly to demonstrate that the right to inclusive education has a central place with respect to human rights and is the key to access to other rights. Secondly, it allows us to reflect on the fact that today there are still quite a lot of a high number of children with disabilities that also do not have access to their rights and their fundamental rights in terms of having access to schools and of course.
Nous démontre que l'éducation n'a pas été en réalité conçue comme un droit de l'homme et que son effectivité n'a pas été réalisée jusqu'à maintenant. En tant que tel, le droit à l'éducation particulièrement inclusif et toute politique contre l'exclusion et la pauvreté, car il est le levier de la cohésion sociale et de l'instauration de la vraie démocratie. Il y a donc le droit de liberté, le droit de responsabilité, le droit de capacité. Donc, la violation du droit à l'éducation inclusive est une violation de tous les droits, de tous les autres droits, parce qu'ignorer les identités des personnes handicapées, en particulier les enfants, les jeunes, cela signifie les priver des moyens de combattre la pauvreté, de combattre d'avoir les vies privées, leur capacité de bâtir leur vie, de tisser des liens sociaux, de vivre leur développement. Et ces violations sont souvent responsables de la propagation de la pauvreté, de la misère et de la violence dans notre société. Donc, l'éducation inclusive, c'est un droit, non pas un besoin. Et tous les enfants ont le droit égal à cette éducation. Pour cela, donc, il faut rendre l'école accessible à tous, même si cela ne suffit pas, car il faut supprimer tous les obstacles économiques, sociaux et culturels qu'il y a. L'exclusion s'exprime à des moments différents qui ont des effets communicatifs qui peuvent contribuer à des exclusions sociales. Chacun des enfants handicapés non scolarisés est la preuve d'une promesse non ténue. Réaliser cette promesse donc signifie que la communauté internationale, que chaque gouvernement révise leur engagement envers les droits à l'éducation en augmentant la possibilité à chaque enfant, quelle que soit sa situation, qu'il aille, mais aussi reste à l'école avec une éducation de qualité et un bon enseignant qualifié. Par contre, la société actuelle, si on réfléchit bien, crée des nouveaux exclus qui deviennent des personnes vulnérables en fonction des fonctions de vie, d'apprentissage et d'éducation. C'est donc le système éducatif qui a été souvent ainsi pour le développement social, bien éloigné du développement de la personne, car l'égalité de chances comme la mixité ou la cohésion sociale, au lieu de chercher l'intérêt supérieur de l'enfant. Aujourd'hui donc, la société civile est appelée à la rescousse de l'État. La corrélation avec le pouvoir public est définie pour examiner le rôle respectif concernant le financement et la prestation de services. Un pas dans la bonne direction est donné par le cadre d'action 2030 de l'UNESCO. Le document confirme que l'éducation est une cause commune qui implique que la formulation et la mise en œuvre publique soient un processus inclusif. État, société civile, parents, communauté, enseignants, familles, enfants, que tous ont un rôle important. Je vous invite à relire calmement le paragraphe 80 de cette déclaration, de ce document. Par rapport à tout ce qui a été exposé, la Coalition nationale de Madagascar son rôle en tant que société civile à Madagascar en pointant du doigt l'urgence d'une éducation inclusive à Madagascar. Pour ce faire, nous avons adopté le principe d'accompagnateur auprès du ministère de l'Éducation en collaboration étroite avec des partenaires techniques et financiers, à la création d'espaces de concertation et d'échange, à la mise en place de la plateforme nationale de l'éducation inclusive à Madagascar, la PNEI. Entre-temps, afin de mieux rouler dans une même direction, la PNEI, dont notre coalition est membre du comité technique de pilotage, a décidé d'harmoniser la façon de voir de toutes les parties prenantes à travers la conception et l'élaboration d'un document de cadrage de l'éducation inclusive à Madagascar. Ceci vers l'avancement d'harmonisation des modules de formation pour les enseignants. Par rapport à sa situation juridique, l'éducation inclusive à Madagascar, le décret 1147 a déjà vu le jour, mais il y a bien longtemps, mais jusqu'à présent n'a pas été l'objet d'adoption après la succession de 3 ministres au sein du ministère de tutelle de l'éducation. En parlant de la qualité de l'éducation inclusive, il reste beaucoup à faire au pays. En voyant les conditions de précarité de beaucoup d'enseignants, surtout après le passage des cyclones et l'entrée de la COVID à Madagascar, il reste encore une lutte à longue haleine. Entrant dans ce cadre, nous nous sommes engagés avec l'Humanité Inclusion à Madagascar dans la mise en œuvre du projet LASIA, en mettant en évidence l'urgence de renforcement de capacités, l'augmentation des compétences, les niveaux de connaissances, ainsi que la prise de conscience des droits et obligations pour arriver à un plaidoyer mûrement réfléchi avec une planification minutieuse qui est plus importante car nous travaillons dans un environnement sociopolitique complexe. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. It's great to be able to have such a concrete example. I'm really thrilled that we have so many questions and sorry that we won't have time to answer them all properly. Some of the presenters are typing answers to some of the questions, so please monitor the chat, but I will try to ask a question to as many of the speakers as possible. Starting with you, Hannah, a couple of questions that came up. One was a very specific one about the Education Policy Academy, who participated and whether it's just for ministry staff or does it get down to the grassroots. A related question that I would ask is there any link to the package that's being put on by UNICEF and UNESCO for ministries of education on education sector planning? And then a slightly different question, but I would hope that you could respond to it. There was a question about whether countries really understand and support reasonable accommodation. And I wonder what your experience has been in the countries that you mentioned. So to you, Hannah.
Thanks so much, Diane, and thank you everybody for very interesting questions. For Rwanda Policy Academy, we actually had the two participants who were part of the IIEP UNESCO activities for education sector planning and analysis, part of the Policy Academy. So the way we work, we always try to really look what's already going on and build on other activities that have been already helpful. I think in Rwanda, it also was really good to have inclusive education initiative supporting the activities already. So it was possible to really support that time within the country. So the participants were actually from the Ministry of Education, from Health. Also, we had a suggestion to look at future policymakers. So we had university part of it. We also had students who were finalizing their PhDs. Part of it. In addition, civil society actors as well as other donor organization representatives were involved. So I think the Rwanda example really showed that we need a multi-sectoral approach for any activities that we are doing. So then looking at the reasonable accommodation, I think this is definitely still a challenge. And really looking at different systems on where the decisions are made. So I think it's critical to understand that who really knows the situation in the classroom and in the community where we have the learner with disabilities. So sometimes there are also examples of reasonable accommodation or assistive devices can be shared for school, but then those cannot be taken home, or reasonable accommodations are not also there when we've been experiencing the pandemic and the challenges of distance learning. But I think it's important really to look at what is the information that we have available, what additional information need to be collected in order to understand what is really needed, that learners with disabilities are not only included physically, but that they can actually learn, participate and achieve in learning. Let me stop there, thanks.
Just one part of that, Hannah, are any civil society representatives besides universities included, any organizations of persons with disabilities or other NGOs, or is it primarily aimed at government personnel?
So civil society was represented, hopefully you can still hear me. So there were organizations with persons with disabilities. There were actually also participants with disabilities in our Rwanda Inclusive Education Policy Academy. And this is what we are also hoping to see when going forward and having other cohorts. Definitely that dialogue needs to be there. and especially those who might also be persons with disabilities who might already be part of the education sector activities, either within the organization or the structures of the ministry. We have some examples of that as well. So it's very, very important to have that as part of the participants. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. Josh, I'm going to turn to you now. A question about whether all USAID projects require inclusion of learners with disabilities, all education projects require inclusion of learners with disabilities. And if projects do include that in their proposals, what kind of monitoring is there of the results to make sure that that is really happening?
Thank you for that question. So it's not a simple answer, but first I want to respond to the first part. Are all USAID funded projects, is there funding for disability? And the simple answer is no. We don't have specific funding tied to disability inclusion. However, part of the Global Disability Summit that we just had, the Education Office made 4 commitments. One is related to data, which I talked about. The other one is related to UDL, which is Universal Design for Learning. We committed that starting currently at the start of the new fiscal year in October of this year, starting then and going forward, all new USAID education programming will include principles of universal design for learning. That then means it will then influence any new education programming, which will include considerations tied to UDL, as well as UDL is a framework that benefits students with disabilities, as well as other marginalized populations like girls, women, LGBTQI+, Indigenous people. However, disability also. Through that commitment, USAID programming must take into consideration and address disabilities, disabled people and their needs. Second part, do programming. The second part of the question is asking about projects including MEL and how we monitor that that's happening in our programming. As I mentioned during my comments, Education Disability Measurement Toolkit, that includes many different tools and resources that we have developed, and we have also influenced to our country offices to include within their education programming. We already have a requirement that there must be a MEL plan in place. So here at the Center for Education, we are currently engaging and working with country offices to make sure that they are including that in their MEL plan related to disability and disability disaggregated data. And we are also setting new indicators related to disability. For example, how many children and youth are above the threshold, the literacy threshold, and how many children with disabilities. That's just one indicator example. So yes, we are incrementally doing that through all of our programming, and we're really so excited to see what comes out of this new commitment going forward.
Thanks, Josh. I'm not sure if you're on top of the specific data from all of the projects, but we had a question wondering about any specific lessons coming out of the work in Nepal. Are you prepared to talk about that?
Unfortunately, I'm not prepared to make a statement like that on that. Right now, we're still working on a draft report, and within that report, yes, I'm not prepared to talk about that. But once that report is released, all that information will be in there. Okay,
that's great. Sorry to put you on the spot, but people are really interested in knowing what you're finding. Marie, there are a number of questions that were posted about the situation in South Africa. I hope that you've been monitoring, and I wonder if you could just give some general response to the questions that you've seen.
Yes, some of the participants are requesting links to some of the policy documents and guidelines, and I'm putting the address to which they can ask this question in the chat box. I think the big issue of, I think there's one question about out-of-school children. I think it's one of the realities of sub-Saharan Africa, I guess also all middle to low income countries, that children with severe disabilities are still, as UNICEF has indicated, not seen, not counted, and that it's really incremental how they get included. Many countries respond by building more special schools. Others try to expand the number of schools that are equipped to do inclusion. But I think what is important is that in South Africa, the right to access your local neighborhood school is embedded in the system. I think what has been learned from the South African experience is how long it takes and how difficult it is to transfer funds from a segregated system into one integrated inclusive system and make sure that everyone has access, without differentiating between level of disability and so on. The question on the standards for these inclusive schools, there is a standard set, and this is also monitored by the Auditor General of South Africa. So all provincial departments have to respond or reply to the Auditor General on an annual basis to what extent they've met the standards for inclusive schools, with which goes additional funding. So I think there's no much more time to answer more questions. If there's anything specifically that you think I should respond to, I can do that as well.
Thank you, Marie. I think what I'll do is ask all of the panelists to respond to a question. You just referred a little bit to the issue of why children with disabilities aren't in school, but there was also a question about learners with disabilities dropping out of high school. And I'm just wondering if any of you have any comments on why that's happening and what can be done to stop that, or at least to slow the trickle of students out of school. Hannah, do you want to make a comment on that?
If Hannah can't, I can also say something, Diane.
Okay, why don't you go first then, Marie?
Okay, I think, one of the big issues coming out of the SDGs is the big need for the growth in technical vocational education. And I think that many children round about the age of 14, 15 are more inclined to go into vocational tracks. And I think that many systems, and it's actually a big global debate driven by UNESCO, is how to improve or reduce early school leaving by making provision for the curriculum needs of children who would rather go on a skills track and a vocational track. So in South Africa, that has been one of the major initiatives that's been driven to reduce learner dropout. That's just one way. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Before I turn to you, Hannah and Josh and Huguette, we'd be interested in hearing from you as well. I made a reflection after Claudia's presentation, and I'm sorry that she's not here to talk about it, but just wondering how you think those of us who are concerned about including learners in disability can make sure that the information about the exclusion of learners with disabilities from education is more prominent in the SDG4 reporting. And I'm thinking specifically of the impact that this may have on the Transforming Education Summit in September, but more broadly in terms of what governments are thinking about in their own reporting on SDG4. So I'll turn to you, Hannah, and then to Josh, and then Huguette, if you'd like to add as well. Hannah.
Thank you so much, Diane. Let me quickly also mention a comment for the previous question that you had. I think we're still suffering from the era of education for all, which was really looking at early grades, let me say like that. So I think that was the time when the governments could not really work with secondary or post-secondary education. So I think it's important to acknowledge this, what needs to be done in different levels of education and what does the country need depending where they are at. And I think it's perhaps this part as well that could be included into the current reporting and really understand what does quality education actually mean? What does a quality learning experience actually entails? So in order to be able to have more information and also understanding across different actors, it's important to elaborate, thinking of through the education system, different levels of it, and also really unpack the quality and really, universal learning, universal design for learning is a kind of approach that really benefits for everybody. So I think that's also important to acknowledge and bring up more. Let me stop there.
Thank you. We have 4 minutes left. So Josh, I'm going to give you 1 minute. I'm going to ask Huguette for 1 minute, and then Julia McGowan wants to say something as well. So 1 minute, Josh, the clock is ticking.
Excellent. Thank you so much. In my perspective, the bottom line is the issue is people's perception on people with disabilities. I think they think people with disabilities are different. They need to be separated, or we should use caution, but it's not, we don't see them as a part of the education system, which is the bottom line biggest problem. Hannah mentioned that universal design for learning, that I think can be part of the solution. If we all can recognize that every single student has their individual learning needs, that an education system has the capacity to meet all of those needs, then we are able to make progress towards inclusion. I think that we need to change the expectation of what is quote unquote normal. And I think one big gap is resources. We as a global community keep on taking a look at education as something that isn't a priority. Funding has been decreasing for education. I think that's another barrier also. So there are more, yes, but in the interest of time, I will turn it over.
Thank you. Julia kindly was responding in the chat. Huguette, do you want to make a last comment? We can't hear you, Huguette.
Oui, excusez-moi, le micro a été mal. Oui, par rapport à la déscolarisation, ce qu'on pourra faire pour le décrochage scolaire, c'est que il existe plusieurs raisons. Il faut voir d'abord les raisons.
You have to look at the reasons and see why, and to offer education. It's not only the issue with the government or the ministry. You have to also involve the entire community. You have to involve the family so that children can go back to school. You also have the possibility to also give education at home. This is something that could be a solution. If the child has a profound disability, there are several ways to go around this and to make sure that this child can go back to school, receive an education. You first have to be able to make sure that you know this in each community, in each of the schools, and in the association or civil society that should be a part of this. You could also have the education either in the school or at home. And this has to be everybody's business. So I don't know if you understand what I was trying to say, but I wanted to say that there should be a way to fight against lack of schooling. We have to fight against that. We have to preserve education. We have to make sure that we slow it down. And we also need to set up a mechanism to send children back to school so that they can actually have, that they want to go back to school, whether it's in primary school or other. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I can't resist a personal comment that I would be very cautious about promoting teaching at home, because that's too often been used as a way to keep kids, particularly with intellectual or multiple disabilities, out of the system. But we don't have time for that debate today. Clearly, the fact that there was so much discussion is an indication of the interest in this topic. Really appreciate all of the presenters, did wonderful jobs, and thank the rest of you for your good comments, questions, and keep up the good fight. Thank you very much.